So it's loading. Okay, great. And I'm going to start the webinar. Okay, great. So attendees are now coming in.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Saturday morning session of CUNY 2021. The Saturday evening session for those of us who are joining us from Asia, and the Saturday afternoon session for those in Europe. Special thanks if anybody's joining us from California at the Saturday very early morning session for CUNY. We're gonna wait a minute to let everybody log in and get comfortable in your own chairs, I guess. And then we're gonna move to the first talk. Jingguan, I think you can share your screen.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now.
Just a little reminder as we're getting set up, the questions can be sent during the talk through the Q&A function. Please indicate when you send your question if you are an early career researcher, as we, as per CUNY tradition, would like to prioritize those questions. Okay. So our first talk is How Do People Interpret Implausible Sentences by Zhengguan Tsai, Nan Zhao, and Martin Pickering, and it will be given by Zhengguan Tsai. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Daphne, for the introduction. Today I'm going to talk about a study that we did on how people interpret implausible sentences. And so I'm going to play you a sentence. I hope you can hear this.
The mother gave the candle the daughter.
So if I ask you whether the daughter has received something, I suppose different people may have different answers. And that's reasonable because the sentence you heard was implausible. So there's apparent implausibility in our daily language for different reasons. For example, speakers may try to be saying something surprising. People may misanalyze a sentence. For example, if you treat dresses as a verb, then the sentence here is implausible. There could be a speech error such that if the original sentence was the mother gave the candle to the daughter, if two was omitted in speech, and the sentence would become implausible. Similarly, something could happen in misperception and the two was missed too. So misinterpretation of implausible sentences can occur quite often, as shown by Gibson and colleagues. So how do people interpret implausible sentences? And what might this tell us about language comprehension? In this talk, we're going to contrast two accounts. Now, according to the structural reanalysis account, people directly revise the sentence structure in order to arrive at a plausible interpretation. For example, at comprehending implausible double object or DO dative sentence like this one, they can simply revise it into the mother gave the candle to the daughter. Similarly, at comprehending an implausible prepositional object, a PO dative, they can revise it into something like the mother gave the daughter the candle to make it plausible. So this account is consistent with theories assuming that semantic interpretation is rid of a syntactic analysis. Now, in contrast, the semantic reanalysis account would assume that people can directly revise the semantic representation of a sentence. For example, comprehending an implausible dative, you come up with such a semantic representation which is implausible. And what you can do is simply you can swap the semantic roles for candle and daughter and then arrive at a plausible interpretation. And this account is consistent with theory that assume that semantic interpretation can be achieved independently of syntax. So there has been research on how people interpret implausible sentences. Gibson et al., for example, had participants listen to implausible sentences like these ones, and then they asked participants a question like this. Did the daughter receive someone something? A yes answer will indicate that people misinterpret the sentences. A no answer indicate that they literally interpret these sentences. And what they showed is that there are more misinterpretations for implausible PO sentences than for implausible PO sentences. And they argue that that's because it's easier for people to assume that an intended PO sentence can be more easily corrupted into an implausible PO sentence by omitting the provision 2 than for people to corrupt an intended PO into implausible PO. There has also been research using structure priming to look at implausible sentences. So structure priming refers to a tendency for people to repeat a syntactic structure that they have previously processed. For example, now if I ask you to describe this picture in English, there's these two ways. You can say active sentence like the boy pinks the girl, or you can say a passive sentence like the girl was pinched by the boy. And for example, now if people are given primes, plausible primes to comprehend first, and then describe this picture, and then they're more likely to produce passive descriptions following a plausible passive sentence, like the fish was caught by the angler, then following a plausible active sentence, like the angler caught the fish, and this structure priming. Now, what was interesting was that Christensen et al. Also presented implausible primes for participants to comprehend, and what they show is this. So participants produced more passive descriptions following implausible active sentence, like the fish caught angler, then following implausible passive sentence, like the angler was caught by the fish. And this suggests that implausible sentences seem to give rise to reversed structure priming. So this is reversed here, really. Let me use a pointer easier, pointer here. Yeah. And what this also did not really directly address the question of how people interpret implausible sentences. So these are the questions that we focus today on this talk. So do people engage in structural analysis when they encounter an implausible sentence? For example, do they revise an implausible PO into a PO and implausible PO into a PO? Now, if so, the primary effect, the tendency for people to repeat a structure should be reduced following implausible primes than plausible primes. Second, do people engage in more structural analysis if they misinterpret an implausible sentence than if they literally interpret it? And if so, again, priming should be reduced following misinterpreted than literally interpreted implausible primes. So to address these questions, we did 3 experiments. In the first one, we manipulated the plausibility of a prime sentence. So it could be a plausible one or an implausible one. We also manipulated the structure. It could be a DO sentence or a PO sentence. And then we asked participants to answer a question about the sentence so that we know whether they literally interpret or misinterpret the sentence. And then ask them to describe a picture, which can be described using a PO sentence or a PO sentence. And we use different verbs between a prime and a target in this experiment and also experiment 2. So the experiment was run online on Qualtrics. So participants first heard a prime sentence, they answered a yes or no question about the sentence, and then they typed in a picture description. So let's look at the how people interpreted the prime sentences based on their answers to the comprehension question. So it showed that there were more misinterpretations for implausible DO sentences than for implausible PO sentences, which replicate what Gibson et al. Found in 2013, which is great. And then let's focus on the priming data. So after the prime and the question, they described a picture using a DO sentence or a PO sentence. And so when the primes were plausible, right, and the DO prime led to about 31% DO responses, which means 69% PO responses. They add up to 100%, right? And the PO prime led to about 17% DO responses. So from there, we can calculate the priming effect for plausible primes, which is basically the difference between DO prime and PO prime, 14% here, right? And now when the primes were implausible, we got about 24% DO responses following DO primes, 23 DO responses for following PO prime. So the priming effect for the implausible primes will be 1%. So obviously, structure priming was reduced following implausible than plausible primes. And we'll argue that that's because people structurally reanalyze these implausible primes. And next, I'm going to zoom in on these implausible primes. So an implausible prime can be either literally interpreted or misinterpreted, right? And we'd like to see how these interpretations impact subsequent structure priming. So when an implausible prime was literally interpreted, there was about 3% in priming, right? Priming effect. But when it was misinterpreted, there's a priming effect of -1%. And so there was reduced structure priming following misinterpreted than literally interpreted implausible primes. Therefore, we believe that there was more structural reanalysis when people misinterpret an implausible sentence. Well, but was the priming a consequence of task order? So experiment 1, they had the prime first, and then the question, and then the picture. So to address the issue, in experiment 2, we swapped the order of the question and the picture so that participants heard the prime, and then they provide a picture description before they answered a question about the prime. And again, we found more misinterpretations for implausible DO than PO sentences, as in experiment 1, which again is great. On the priming data, when the primes were plausible, there's a priming effect of 10%, but when the primes were implausible, there was a priming effect of 6%. And well, the difference was marginally significant. So it showed that there was again reduced priming effect following implausible than plausible primes, suggesting structural reanalysis in interpreting implausible sentences, as we observed in experiment 1. And again, let's focus on the implausible primes. So when the implausible prime was literally interpreted, there was a 10% priming effect. When it was misinterpreted, there was a 5% priming effect. Now, despite the difference here, it was actually not significant statistically, but this could be due to the experiment being underpowered. So to summarize so far, we found reduced structure priming following implausible than plausible primes, suggesting that participants engaged in at least some structural reanalysis when interpreting implausible sentences. Now, regarding the priming effect for misinterpreted and literally interpreted implausible primes, the results were a bit mixed. The answer was yes in E1, where the question was answered first, but not in E2, where the picture was described first. But as I said, this could be a power problem. So we did a third experiment, which we pre-registered. And this experiment used the same verb between prime and target to increase power in priming. So the experiment, as in the first two experiments, manipulated the plausibility and the structure of the prime sentence. In addition, it also manipulated task order. So in one block, participants would answer the question first and then describe the picture. And in another block, they would describe the picture first and answer the comprehension question. So as I said, there are same word between prime and target. So again, there were more misinterpretations for implausible DO than PO sentences as in earlier experiments. On the priming data, now, so in the question first block, this is where they answer the question first and then describe the picture, right? So when the there was reduced structure priming when the prime was implausible compared to when the prime was plausible. And this is a result replicated what we observed in experiment 1. This is what I presented earlier. Now in the other block where they describe picture first and then answer the question, we observed the same pattern. So structure priming was reduced when the prime was implausible compared to when the prime was plausible. And this again replicated what we found in experiment 2. So in general, there was reduced structure priming following implausible than plausible primes, suggesting structural reanalysis for implausible sentences. Now, if you focus on the reduction due to implausibility, the reduction was similar across the 2 blocks, question first and picture first. Now let's focus on the implausible primes again. So when the primes were in the question first block, there was again a reduction in structure priming when the implausible prime was misinterpreted than when it was literally interpreted. Again, replicating what I showed earlier in experiment 1. So in the other block where they describe picture first, we observe a similar reduction for the misinterpreted implausible primes compared to the literally interpreted implausible primes. And this resembled the pattern in experiment 2, though actually in experiment 2, we did not find a significant difference there. So it could be due to power, because we increase in power, now we observe the difference. So in general, there was reduction in structure priming following misinterpreted than literally interpreted implausible primes. And so that suggests more structural reanalysis when people misinterpret an implausible sentence.
5 minutes.
Now, thank you. So in terms of reduction, we found similar reduction due to misinterpretation across between the 2 blocks, regardless whether people answer the question first or describe the picture first. So summarize of all the experiments, people are less likely to repeat a prime structure when a prime is implausible than plausible. And when an implausible prime is misinterpreted, then literally interpreted. And these tendencies are unaffected by the order of the comprehension question and the picture description. So we suppose that these findings support the structural reanalysis account, but what happens there? So let's imagine that you hear a plausible sentence, like the mother gave the daughter the candle. So how do you do this? Of course, you construct a DO analysis based on the sentence, and then you derive a literal interpretation. And when you have to describe a picture, that DO analysis that you constructed would prime you to use a DO sentence here. So everything's straightforward. But what happens if you encounter an implausible sentence like this one? The mother gave the candle to the daughter. So believe there are 2 scenarios. In one, you construct a DO analysis based on the input of the sentence. You also build a reanalysis, a pure analysis. But you rely more on the DO analysis so that you derive a literal interpretation. And later, when you have to describe picture, the DO analysis that you relied more on will prime you to use a DO response in the picture description. However, in the second scenario, of course, you build a DO analysis for the input sentence, but you also come up with a PO reanalysis and rely more on the PO reanalysis and derive a misinterpretation. And later, when you have to describe picture, you're primed to use a PO sentence. And because you entertain both analysis in the comprehension of the implausible sentence, there was reduced structure priming for these implausible sentences compared to the plausible ones. And reduction is actually more if you misinterpret an implausible sentence. Well, but you may wonder why do people have to do structural reanalysis? Well, I think it probably has a lot to do with the incremental and predictive nature of language processing. For example, in spoken language comprehension, when you hear the mother gave the candle, I suppose at this point, actually, you're predicting a preposition to and a noun phrase to follow up, right? A PO's analysis to follow up. But when what you actually hear is daughter next, when you have to reanalyze, the PO structure is there already for you to reanalyze. So it's easier for you to reanalyze the structure. But we may want to ask whether people can actually swap the positions of the nouns instead of changing to the alternative structure. For example, at hearing the mother gave the candle to the daughter, can you simply swap the positions of two nouns and revise it into mother gave the daughter the candle? And we think it's possible. I don't have time to elaborate on this, but there's a short talk by Jian Bai later today, if you're interested. And I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Let's give a big round of applause to our speaker. Thank you, Jingguan. And we have a question from Chris Hammerly. Chris, you're going to get a request to unmute yourself.
I got it. Okay. Hello.
Excellent.
Awesome talk.
Hi.
So I'll just kind of read out my question here. So basically, I noticed that it seems like the prime sentences all kind of trade on animacy differences. And we know since Bach and Warren, 1986, that these definitely have an effect on the choice of PD versus DO structure. And so I'm basically just curious what role animacy might play, how it fits into your overall picture.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, we did not really consider that in our study because I think, if I remember correctly, I think there's a study recently in JML by Huang et al. Showing that animacy seem not to matter that much in structural priming, at least in Chinese. They did a study, I think they did quite a few experiments in Chinese, showing that actually the animacy of the two objects in a dative structure does not really impact structure priming.
All right, that's an interesting result in and of itself. So thank you.
Thank you.
Our second question comes from Gail Monner. Gail, you will get a request to unmute yourself.
Yep, I think I'm unmuted.
You are.
Hi.
Hi.
So you've been characterizing your sentences as implausible. Some of us might characterize them as ungrammatical. That is, when you have a double object construction, the noun closest to the verb is supposed to be the recipient. And so when people read these sentences, they might find them not just implausible, but ungrammatical. And so I'm wondering what you think that might have, what role that might play in your results, if that's what's going on in their processing.
Right. So I think that's a good point, really. Like, I think it depends how you define ungrammaticality, right? So I think in what we're trying to say is actually, so a sentence can be syntactically well-formed, but
Semantically ill-formed, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's the case. If you say the mother gave the candle the daughter, right? Because the candle here cannot serve as a recipient semantically, but now if you can say I gave the candle a flow of air, I think in that case, candle can actually occur in that position, right? So I think it's not really due to this the inability for candle to serve as a direct object here, but actually its inability to serve as a recipient when the theme is daughter. I
Right.
think
And this is different from some of the other sentences you showed, like, it is implausible for a fish to eat the angler, but if the fish is big enough, it could literally, happen. And so those really are just implausible, or that the dog bit the man, or the man bit the dog rather than the dog bit the man. Those are truly implausible. But this seems to be something well beyond that.
Yeah, I think implausibility is really kind of not rigid, right? So I think studies by Newland show that, for example, you can say no, the girl and the clock comforted each other, right? If actually that sentence occurs in a fairy tale story, right? So here actually you can even make a sentence like, no, the fish caught the angler as very plausible in a fairy story, for example.
So I guess I'll just leave this as a something for you to think about. I think there is a difference between implausibility and impossibility, and that's something that I think should be considered in going forward with this. That are your materials really truly implausible, or are they really impossible? And if they're impossible, what effect is that having on the initial interpretation of the sentence, and how is that going to be influencing your priming results?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So
Thank
our
you.
next question comes from Ivan Bondok, and I'm going to read this question. Thank you for this interesting talk. How much do you think is the extent to which people are influenced by semantic knowledge in their syntactic reanalysis?
Right, I think that's a good point. I think, well, I think you decide to reanalyze because the initial interpretation is implausible. Otherwise, you don't need to reanalyze, right? So I think then it's greatly influenced by the semantic understanding of the sentence. I'm not sure whether that answers your question.
We're gonna leave it there. Our next question comes from Whit Tabor.
Hi. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. So first, again, this is super interesting work.
Thank you. And
my question ends up actually really being a follow-on to Gail Monner's question a couple back. But a sense to push the point and possibly raise an important empirical question that I think still needs to be answered. And it's basically, your analysis is compatible with the idea that what's happening in a question like the mother gave the candle the daughter is that people are just changing the structure to a different one in order to make it grammatical and then getting the new interpretation. But on that view, ultimately, they're just they're ultimately getting a grammatical structure out of the sentence. But Gail's question was kind of pushing on the possibility that they might not be getting a good sentence out of that sentence. So I would really like to know if there is some kind of thing that's happening on your analysis where something not well formed can be constructed. This would go in the direction of things like good enough parsing and self-organized parsing, which I've explored a bit. So that seems to me something very interesting here, which you're raising.
Yes, thank you very much. So whether there's any good enough processing going on here, I don't think our data is conclusive on that issue. I think it's possible. So one possibility is, though I think it's not likely, is that people just do semantic reanalysis, and then that semantic reanalysis has some syntactic consequence, leading people to revise the sentence anyway. But I think that's very uneconomical, and I'm not sure whether the parser would do something like that. But so we did some analysis that I did not have time to present, for example. So what I show is, it seems some syntactic process is responsible jointly for structure priming and sentence interpretation. For example, remember like in the picture first, question second condition, right? So what I show is, if people are primed, so if they're given a implausible DO and they give a DO picture description, and later when they answer the comprehension question, they tend to give a literal interpretation. But if the picture description is unprimed, for example, if you're given a DO implausible sentence, but you produce a PO picture description, and later you tend to give a misinterpretation on the comprehension question. And I think that data would suggest, well, so there's a correlation between structure priming and subsequent question answering. And that is probably due to some common syntactic process in the interpretation of the implausible sentence.
All right, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's thank Jingguan again, and we're going to move on to our next talk.
Thank you very much.
David,
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing.
please.
Great, can you see my screen?
Almost. Now we can. So our next
Screen now?
talk, we're good. Yep.
Great.
Our next talk is New Neighbors Make Bad Fences, Form-Based Semantic Shifts in Word Learning by David Hazlett and Jingguan Cai. Take it away.
Great, thanks. So hi, I am Dave Hazlett. I'm a PhD student here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. This is a project I've been doing with my supervisor, Jingguan Cai, who is the previous presenter. And to give you a sense of what we're talking about, I'll begin with a few examples, and you can play along at home by simply thinking of the meanings of these words. So we have expunge, hermetic, evince. Expunge means to erase, and people often think of wiping away. Hermetic means isolation, or rather occurs in contexts such as hermetically sealed, which imply isolation. And evince means to prove or to demonstrate. Responses like these are all accurate and totally fine, but they've changed in interesting ways over time. So if you look at the etymology of expunge, it's related to the word puncture, but it sounds like the word sponge. And it appears that it's somehow borrowed some of these semantic features of sponge, such as wiping. Similarly, hermetic is etymologically related to Hermes, the name Hermes, but it sounds like hermit, and it's possible that it's borrowed the semantic feature of isolation from hermit. And the word evince has changed quite radically over time. It's etymologically related to the word evict, but it now often refers to evidence, and it clearly has shifted toward evidence in a pretty conspicuous way. And if you read the Oxford English Dictionary, you might notice that the meaning of expunge is indeed believed, suspected to have been influenced by the similarity to the pronunciation of sponge. But there is no such commentary regarding hermit, either in the OED or anywhere else. And even in the very conspicuous case of evince, shifting towards evidence, there's no mention of the influence of evidence. So this is what we're calling form-based semantic shifts. The idea that words that are pronounced similarly can shift in meaning towards each other. So form can affect meaning in this way. And again, it's acknowledged by the Oxford English Dictionary, as well as the Oxford Guide to Etymology, but in only in very rare cases, and it seems that they overlook many other instances. And of course, this is anecdotal evidence. It's entirely possible that these are exceptions or even coincidences, which is why it's interesting to note that there is a phenomenon like this, that it seems to occur throughout the lexicon. So there are recent papers demonstrating or presenting findings that words that sound similar tend to have similar meanings. And this is a small correlation, but a significant correlation. It's found in 100 languages, and closer inspection of English suggests that it's true even after accounting for etymological relationships and for pockets of sound symbolism. The point there being that it's possible that small clusters of a lot of phonostemes or other sound symbolic instances could skew the averages and sort of make what is actually an arbitrary lexicon appear to be iconic or appear to have this phenomenon. But on the contrary, it appears that the lexicon is in general iconic, and this appears to be the case of languages in general. Furthermore, there is evidence that this correspondence between form and meaning is greater in words that have a lower and earlier age of acquisition. So words that are learned earlier tend to be more iconic. And this matches previous findings where iconicity ratings given by participants are higher for words with lower age of acquisition. So there's a correlation between age of acquisition and iconicity. And this fits with previous work dealing with sign language and learnability, such that words that get higher iconicity ratings tend to be easier to learn. All of which suggests that this iconicity we see in the lexicon functions to facilitate learning. And the question is then, where does the iconicity come from? How does this happen? One possibility is that word forms can change over time. So words with similar meanings might shift towards one another to become similar in pronunciation or spelling or sign. And this is suggested as to be possible by iterated learning experiments. So for example, if you have two similar objects like a red square moving in a loop and a red circle moving in a loop with arbitrarily assigned novel word labels like bikawi and rebiho, which sounds dissimilar, and then you ask people to recall those word forms when they're presented with the objects, you end up often with sort of a systematic iconic mapping where similar items tend to have similar word forms. So this is one possible explanation, but it's different obviously from the examples I just presented, given that those examples, it appears that meanings are changing rather than word forms. And so this is the phenomenon that we're going to try and present evidence for today. So we've conducted some novel word learning experiments. In experiment number 1, participants would learn the meanings of novel words by reading them in sentence contexts. And then they would demonstrate the inferred meaning. They demonstrate the meaning that they learned by giving ratings on a 7-point scale. And they would also give ratings for existing words. And then we can compare the ratings of those words. So let me give you some examples to show you what I'm talking about. The first sentence in a set of 3 would be the constraining sentence, the sentence that implies the meaning of the novel word. So you could read Lewis blanks in school, often getting perfect scores on tests. Here we have 4 conditions for possible words. There is the implied word, excel. We have the 2 novel words in blue and red, struggin and shown. In blue, we have the novel target. So this is similar in form to an existing word, and we're calling the existing similar sounding word the attractor. So struggin sounds like struggle. Struggin is the target, struggle is the attractor. And shom is the control. Shom comes from the ARC non-word database, and it's not similar to any relevant word in this context. So if you're in the novel target condition, you would read Lewis struggling in school, often getting perfect scores on tests. Then you would read an ambiguous sentence, Tricia struggles in many areas, followed by another ambiguous sentence as a test sentence, Midge struggles in her new position, which is presented with a comprehension question. How well suited is Midge to her new position? You would answer this question on a scale of 1 to 7. It's important to note that the implied meaning, excel, will elicit a higher rating. So Midge excels in her new position. How well suited is Midge to her new position? It's designed to elicit a high rating, whereas the attractor struggle, Midge struggles in her new position. How well suited is Midge to her new position? Designed to elicit a low rating. And the question is then, what kind of ratings will the novel words get? And in particular, will the target word, struggin, get a rating that is closer to the attractor word, struggle, compared to the control word, shown? So for the sake of analysis and visualization, we have inverted the ratings for roughly half of the items, where, so by invert, I mean, if someone gives a rating of 7, it becomes a 1, and vice versa, 6 to 2, and so on and so on. And this is to ensure that the attractor words are designed to elicit higher ratings, and the implied words are designed to elicit lower ratings. So what we get is a pattern that looks like this. An attractor word like struggle gets a 5 out of 7. An implied word like excel gets a 2 out of 7. And then, as we can see, the novel words are closer to the implied meaning, but as predicted, and importantly, the target word is closer in ratings to the attractor word compared to the control word. And linear mixed effects modeling shows that this is a significant difference. So this is the pattern we expected, and we replicate this in experiment 2, along with a few differences. So we streamlined the process. In experiment 2, there's only 3 levels. We removed the implied word, just kept the control, target, and attractor. And we also added another part to the task where, after giving the ratings, the participants have to type the word that they've learned from memory. And this is to ensure that they're paying attention to form and to ensure that they're not misreading the target as the attractor. So, for example, they're not reading struggin, reading quickly, thinking it says struggle, and therefore just interpreting it as the attractor. So I'll give you an example to show you what I mean. Here we have another set of materials. Again, the first sentence is the constraining sentence. The firefighters blank the child from the burning building. The implied meaning is rescued or saved. The novel words appear in this context in order to be assigned that meaning for participants to infer that meaning. And we have a slightly different first sentence for the attractor words. The firefighters tormented the child. Still maybe a strange sentence, but a sensible sentence, not so conspicuously incongruent. So we have, again, these would both be the first sentences, a slightly different first sentence for the attractor condition, followed by an ambiguous sentence, Joe has tormented Randy. And then the test sentence, Chen was tormented, how thankful was Chen? And again, a rating on a scale of 1 to 7, for thankfulness in this case, followed by the memory test, typing the word from memory to ensure they've paid attention to form and not confused it for a different word. The results, again, half the items inverted for analysis. So the attractor word is always getting or designed to elicit the higher ratings. The implied meaning elicits lower ratings, as suggested by the ratings given to the novel words. And again, we replicated the overall effect, which is that the target word gets higher ratings than the control words, suggesting that the meaning as interpreted is shifting towards the meaning of the attractor word. The ratings for torment are closer to the ratings for torment when it comes to thankfulness. So in both experiments, just to repeat myself, ratings for the targets shift towards ratings for the similar sounding words, the attractors, when compared to the controls. And this is what we predicted and what we would expect. It's consistent with the examples I presented earlier, suggesting that words can shift in meaning towards similar sounding words. And it also provides an alternative or additional explanation for the origins of iconicity, where it's not just that word forms can change, but word meanings can change as a consequence of form. So form-based semantic shift. However, ratings like these, subjective metalinguistic ratings, have limitations in terms of reliability and generalizability. And so we very recently conducted a third experiment using iterated learning. And so I'll talk about that now. So for experiment 3, iterated learning, similar to previous experiments where participants will learn novel words as labels for objects. In the experiment, these would be videos. So a red triangle moving across the screen, or a blue square moving in a parabola. Participants learn the words as labels for the objects. And then this differs from previous experiments because at test, participants are recalling the object rather than the word form. So we're presenting an opportunity for the meaning to change rather than for the word form to change. And because it's iterated, that means that the participant will recall the object, and the object that they recall will be the object studied by the subsequent participant in that chain. Notice that these objects have 3 dimensions: the color, the shape, and the way that they move. And each of those dimensions has 3 possible values. It could be red, blue, or black, triangle, square, or circle, move in a straight line, move in an arc, move in a loop. And notice that here we have 2 items that are similar sounding words. All of the items, all the words are 6 letters, 3 open syllables, and the similar sounding pairs differ in the middle syllable. And critically, they have zero overlap in the dimensions. So square versus triangle, red versus blue, straight line versus parabola. So they're similar sounding, but designed to be different on all dimensions. So training would look something like this. Participants see the word with the object. Again, it's a video moving on the screen. Then they see the object and have to choose one of 4 word forms that matches the object. Do this 3 times, randomized with the other items. And the point being that they're learning the pairing of object and word form, but they're doing so in a way that focuses on word form. And then during testing, they're given the word form, banoti, and they have to choose one of 3 items that matches the word. So one of those is the correct one on the left, the triangle moving in a straight line, and the other 2 are distractors. As you can see, they all differ on just one dimension. So they're all the same in terms of color and shape, and they just differ in terms of motion. There are 9 objects in total, 6 items and 3 fillers. The items, so that means that there's going to be 3 items for each generation that differ in terms of color at test, 3 that differ in terms of shape at test, and 3 that differ in terms of motion like this. And then for a given item, it will vary on a different dimension for the next generation, meaning that after 3 generations, each item has the opportunity to change on each dimension. So after 3 generations, any given item can become completely different in terms of the meaning, what the object looks like. And again, because it's iterated learning, the object that is chosen by a participant will become the object associated with that word and studied by the next generation. So here's what it would look like being iterated. 3 chains just for illustration for the word banoti. All the participants study the same word because it's how they're designed. At test, these objects will have 3 options that vary in terms of the way that they move, as I showed on the previous screen.
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. The words that they choose will be, or rather the objects that they choose, will be associated with banoti and studied by the next generation. That generation at test will see a different dimension. So the objects rather will vary on a different dimension. So color rather than motion. What they choose is studied by the next generation. And then finally, vary on the 3rd dimension. So shape rather than color or motion. The point being that after 3 generations, again, as in chain 1, you can have a completely different object on all 3 dimensions. And then I suppose the question is now, what's the dependent variable? What are we measuring? So for a given item, we're going to compare it in terms of overlap on the way that the object overlaps with the similar sounding word versus the other words. So banoti is paired with baguti. And again, this is generation 0 as designed. And as I already said, they overlap on 0 dimensions, different color, different shape, different motion. Compare that to the other 4 objects, the 2 other pairs. And for each of these, they overlap on 1 dimension. So we've got triangle, triangle, red, red, triangle, triangle, red, red. And so for generation 0, we have a 0% overlap for the similar sounding words and a 33% overlap for the other words, or the other objects, I should say. And because there are 3 dimensions, each with 3 levels, this 33% overlap is the at chance level. That's what we would expect them to overlap on, all other things being equal. And so we did this for 6 chains over 9 generations. As I just said, similar sounding words begin with the 0% overlap compared to a 33% overlap in the objects associated with the other words. And after 9 generations, there's a roughly 50% overlap for the similar sounding words, whereas the other words stay at roughly the at chance level. So it looks something like this. So again, generation 0, in the light blue is the similar sounding word overlap. It's a 0% overlap as designed versus 33. The other words, the objects overlap on roughly a third of the dimensions consistently across the generations, whereas there is a steady increase in the overlap of the similar sounding words. And if you use linear mixed effects modeling, you see this is a significant interaction of similarity of word form and number of generations. They become more similar over time. There's also a marginal effect of accuracy. So there's an increase in accuracy over time, although only marginal. And as you can see, it kind of tails off after a certain point. It's a pretty challenging task. So it could be that just that there's a ceiling or there's a sort of decrease in returns over time. So we maybe need more generations to see an effect, but it's marginally significant. And the important point is that we have an increase in iconicity, an increase in the similarity of objects associated with similar sounding words. Very quickly, just got 2 minutes, very quickly, a sort of a speculation about how this might occur would be in terms of the complementary learning systems account of word learning. So newly learned words, novel words, such as struggin, will activate similar sounding words such as struggle. So that phonological priming only occurs until lexicalization, until typically after sleep when the word is consolidated into lexicon, after which point we see lexical competition where there is inhibition of the similar sounding words rather than activation. Some recent studies have suggested that therefore we should expect co-activation of similar sounding words during learning. And our suggestion here, speculation but plausible, is that the existing words will therefore interfere with the learned meanings of the new similar sounding words. For example, when someone learns the word hermetic, the word hermit would be activated. If the feature of isolation is congruent with the occurrence, so being hermetically sealed, isolation makes sense. Perhaps it gets associated with hermetic, and therefore it affects the meaning and remains part of the meaning even after hermetic and hermit become competitors after it's lexicalized. Speculation. The important point is that we've provided evidence for form-based semantic shifts in 3 ways. The first is just the anecdotal evidence, where words like events have shifted in meaning towards similar sounding words like evidence. Participants who learned novel words in sentence context, in identical contexts, so tormest and plunge, people will be less thankful to be tormented because it sounds like tormented. And in iterated learning, people can learn similar sounding words associated with different objects. Those objects will be recalled as more similar in meaning or in appearance over time. All of it suggests that form-based semantic shifts are not coincidences or exceptions, but are rather a regular type of semantic change, and with what I hope are interesting implications for the evolution of the lexicon and the learnability of language. Well, we'll stop there. And thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, David. Our first question comes from Gail Monner.
Hi, this was really interesting. I'm wondering a bit about your novel words like struggin. And in particular, I'm wondering, we do have some word families where there's a semantic root that's shared across a number of words like conceive, perceive, and so on. And so what I'm wondering about is whether or not your participants perhaps think that, when they get a novel word like struggin, that they're actually thinking that there's a semantic root that's similar to or part of a word family. And more specifically, I'm wondering what you think would happen if your experiments actually include novel words that share a known semantic root like sieve, like plonsieve or something like that. Would they be more likely to think about the meanings of a word family when they're learning the meanings of these novel words?
Yeah, I think that's what you're describing is a thing called folk etymology, or is a type of folk etymology where people sort of perceive or imagine an etymology where it doesn't exist. And I think that's certainly a plausible explanation, certainly in adult learning. I guess the question would be in child learning whether we see something similar. And yeah, I suspect that if we used existing roots or existing prefixes, we might see a larger effect. People would be maybe more likely to make those inferences. But yeah, I don't have any evidence to that effect.
Thank you. Gail?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Our second question comes from Craig Chambers. It wasn't clear whether Craig wanted me to read the question, so I will Oh, okay, you're here. Okay.
Sorry, I suggested you read it just because there's a garbage truck out my window, but I'll just read what I read. Thanks for an interesting talk. I was just wondering about your predictions about the opposite kind of scenario found in language change. For example, the semantics of the word terrific shifted away from the negative meaning reflected in its derivationally related, what I call form neighbors, like terror, terrifying, terrible, terrorism, and so on. And I was just curious as to whether we should expect shifts in this direction to occur at a rate below chance on your account, and if that would be part of the evidence.
I mean, I think it's there are so many factors at work that, I mean, it makes sense that no one has really studied this before, given that there's so many things that could interfere. I guess I need to look at examples like terrific and the details of how they've evolved over time. I mean, the prediction would be, yeah, I mean, whatever external factors are playing into the evolution of terrific would presumably be need to be stronger, relatively speaking, in order to overpower the similarity of form. But I think it really depends. There's so many factors at work that I can't give you a prediction, I suppose.
Okay, thanks.
But thank you. Yeah.
Our third question comes from Amit Almore. Amit.
Hello. Yes.
Good
Thank
morning.
you. Good morning. Thank you. Very interesting talk. But as a native speaker of Hebrew, I kind of kept wondering about, it kind of really revealed to me the difference between different languages, because I think that in Hebrew, no one would ever think to actually run an experiment to study this question, because the answer would be apparently obvious, because Hebrew is a language that words are very strongly structured around roots for verbs, also nouns. And so it's really transparent, and it's an active kind of learning device. Anyone growing up speaking Hebrew would kind of answer the research question that you posted, with a quick and positive yes, without having to run an experiment. And so I wonder to what extent you think that this is, well, I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about it, the cross-linguistic differences, and the fact that this question makes sense, I think, only in languages that kind of initially hide the systematicity that other languages build upon.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important point is to go back to the original examples where we have words that are explicitly not etymologically related, but that nonetheless become linked. So I suppose the question would be whether you can sort of induce the assumption of etymological relationships even where it doesn't exist.
Right. But if we have a mechanism, as is attested in other languages, that kind of, that is readily available and is in fact taken advantage over by other languages, then wouldn't this be kind of what we might expect? Like, even if this is a strategy that we can actively use and speakers of other languages use all the time to deal with new words, then you would expect that. Like it's kind of a thing that is obviously there. So this was okay. Where my question was coming.
Yeah. From. So I mean, assuming that in those cases you're talking about an explicit mechanism, then the question could be whether you see a similar effect or a different effect in children. But also, it doesn't necessarily address the issue of the meanings changing. So learning is one thing, facilitating learning is important. But having the meanings change over time as a consequence of similarity to other words that are initially different in meaning and unrelated would be a different effect and probably still worth considering.
Right. Thank you.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one more question from Zachary Kevin Maher.
Thanks. Really interesting talk. So you mentioned lexical competition briefly at the end. So this is partially just an invitation to reflect more on that. So I'm wondering in particular in your first two experiments, maybe it's not that the meaning of the novel word is being pulled toward the phonologically similar word, but rather as participants are completing the task, you're observing some kind of probabilistic failure of lexical inhibition. Do you think that is going on? And if that is the case, is that maybe even a mechanism of the process that you have in mind?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the question is. There's no question, presumably, that something involving phonological priming is involved here, and sort of a lack of lexical competition for novel words. I suppose the critical question is the results, is the observed effect in the experiment simply sort of a flawed consequence of that would not be observed in the real world, where if we had sort of a delayed learning for a day later and a week later, would the effect go away? Or is it that this phonological priming is actually part of the learning, and does it affect the inferred meanings and the learned meanings? So I mean, yeah, I would suppose that the phonological priming is what I'm proposing is that it affects the learned meanings, and therefore is, yeah, phonological priming can influence ratings through a failure of competition or a failure of inhibition. But that at the same time, that affects the ultimate outcome of the learned meaning, and therefore is interesting and noteworthy.
Cool, thanks.
Let's all thank David for his wonderful talk.
Thanks.
Garrett, can you share your screen?
Yes.
Excellent.
All right, can you see the slides?
Yep.
Oops.
So
Oh, there it goes.
Ooh.
Okay.
our next talk is by Garrett Smith, and he will talk about a random walk down the garden path, a new implementation of a self-organized parsing. Go for it.
All right, thank you. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about a new model of self-organized parsing. But first, I'm going to talk about birds. We've all seen flocks of birds outside our windows swirling in these big groups. And it seems like they have a common purpose. But we know that the birds don't have a leader. There's no single bird who's telling the other birds in the group to sort of form like a coherent gathering and do stuff together. But instead, this coherent movement as a group emerges solely through the interactions between birds and the other birds nearby. This type of behavior self-organizes through these local interactions. And actually, we can explain this type of behavior if we assume that each bird follows just a couple of rules. So if each bird tries to stay close to birds that it's close to, if it avoids collisions with those birds, and if it matches the speed and direction of nearby birds, then we can get these really cool groups that swirl around in the sky. Today, I'm going to present a new sentence processing model that's based on similar principles, based on self-organization. But first, we'll talk about the traditional approach to word-by-word sentence processing. So all theories of sentence processing, including self-organizing ones, recognize the importance of grammatical rules. Here, just a couple of examples of rules from a dependency grammar. For example, the first one there says that the word the can attach as the determiner of the word coach. Under the traditional view of language comprehension, the grammatical rules of a language combined together determine the set of possible structures that belong in that language. Now, when someone encounters a sentence in real life, for example, say someone's read the first 3 words of the sentence, the coach smiled, we need a parsing algorithm to match this string of words to one or more of the syntactic structures that's sanctioned by the grammar. So we need a parsing algorithm here, and I can take the rules in the grammar and produce a parsed version of this sentence here. Now, importantly, under the traditional view, the parser is assumed not to entertain structures that would lead to an ungrammatical parse. This would be akin to there actually being a leader bird that tells the other birds where to fly and to make sure that any of them that get too far away go back to where they're supposed to be. In sentence processing, this means that as words are added incrementally, for example, in reading, the goal of the parser is to find a structure that integrates each new word so that the resulting structure as a whole for the whole sentence is compatible with the grammar. Now, theories based on this assumption have been very successful in explaining, for example, speedups and slowdowns in word-by-word reading. But there are also some cases where it seems like we need to relax the assumption that every structure that the parser entertains be fully grammatical. An example I'll focus on is local coherence effects, but there are others that we can talk about as well. So consider the sentence from Tabor et al. 2004. The coach smiled at the player throwing the frisbee. This contains a reduced relative clause, but the meaning is pretty clear. Now, if we compare this to the coach smiled at the player tossed the frisbee, all I've done is switched out the word thrown for the word tossed. In the reduced relative clause form of this, it contains a locally coherent structure. The player tossed the frisbee. If this just appeared on its own, it would be a perfectly fine sentence. But in the context of the preceding string, the coach smiled at, analyzing this chunk here as a sentence is just not possible in English. So in an experiment in 2004, Tabor et al. Found that participants spent more time reading the region containing tossed than the region containing thrown, which suggests that there's some competition going on in the tossed condition between the locally coherent structure that doesn't work for a whole sentence and the structure that is grammatical, fully grammatical, and works for the whole sentence. To be fair, there have been, just to quickly note, it's hard to explain this effect under traditional theories, although there have been a number of attempts to, and they're quite interesting and useful. But the point that this brings up is that these findings invite us to consider parsing theories that don't insist that all of the parses be fully grammatical or internally consistent. Instead, we might try to allow structures to assemble themselves under purely local constraints instead of focusing on global constraints. We need a model that should be at least able to try out these sort of structures that can't be compatible with the rest of the sentence. All right, so this has been tried, applying this sort of self-organized thinking. It's been tried a number of times, going back at least 30 years to Kempton and Foss in 1989. But there's also the SOPARS model, self-organized sentence processing that I've worked on, along with others. All of these allow locally coherent, ungrammatical structures to form, so they should be in a good place to explain local coherence effects. But they face a number of issues. First, in many cases, these models are kind of one-off models where it's a model of a single type of sentence, or maybe a small, a handful of them. They're sort of proof of concept models, which is very important. It's an important first step. But if self-organization is going to be considered a general theory of sentence processing, we need to push farther. Also, these models typically have a lot of free parameters that are set by hand. That's not so great because it's really easy to overfit data that way, and it makes the models not very constrained. And then finally, the mathematical implementations of these models are often opaque and difficult to understand, and they're difficult to extend to new types of sentences as well in many cases. So I've been working on a new approach to self-organized sentence processing that I've been calling mParse, and it's had a number of goals. So I want to be able to handle multiple phenomena with a single model. So moving away from proof of concept type models to more at least broader coverage parsing. I wanted this to minimize the number of free parameters and really understand the full range of predictions that are possible given those parameters. There are two free parameters in mParse, and really only one of them is terribly important. And then finally, I was really trying to work with a transparent and flexible mathematical framing. This is the part that I'm actually the most excited about because it allows us to make really detailed quantitative reading time predictions quite easily. So these are some big goals for a single model, and there are a lot of pieces in this model. But I'm now going to step through the pieces and illustrate what happens while the model parses each word in the sentence. So imagine the model has read the string so far, the coach smiled. The model is also endowed with sort of knowledge of binary dependency rules. I've couched this all in terms of dependency grammar, but you can choose a different grammatical theory if you like. And the idea is that at each word in the sentence, mparse enumerates all of the possible parses, partial and complete parses, that are possible given the word so far and its grammar rules. These become states that the model can occupy at any given time, and we'll see exactly what that means in just a sec. And each of these states has a harmony that's a continuous measure of the well-formedness of the syntactic structure that the state contains. Note that these states that are generated in this way include partial parses that are only locally viable, as well as globally coherent, fully grammatical ones. So now we have the states that the model is going to work with. Now we want to see how the model navigates among them. So here I've just taken all the states we just saw, all of the partial parses, and put them in these rectangles. Now, mparse is a model that jumps stochastically between these states. It's a continuous time random walk. That's where the random walk in the title comes from. And we can formalize this using what's known as the master equation in physics and chemistry. There's a lot of cool stuff that goes into the master equation, but I'm going to try to illustrate it visually, what all's going on. The important thing to note here is that mparse can only jump between two states if they differ by a single dependency link. So not all transitions are possible. So the possible transitions are indicated here by the arrows. Yes. And so the thicker arrows indicate that there's a higher transition rate in the direction that the arrow indicates. So there's a higher probability of the model jumping from the source state to the new state per unit time if the arrow is thicker. Basically, mparse prefers to jump from low harmony states to high harmony states, as opposed to going the other way around. It doesn't like to jump from, if it's already got a pretty good parse, it doesn't like to go from there and entertain a less good parse after that. And a noise parameter controls how strong this preference is. So this is kind of a snapshot of what the model looks like at each word. And now I'll give you a taste of what actually the dynamics of what happens during processing at a particular word. So mparse is initialized at some state. For example, it's been initialized here at this no structure state where there are no dependency links between the words. And from here, it jumps with some probability to another state. In this case, it jumped to the state where the word the attaches as the determiner of coach. And it continues jumping around for a while, visiting different states, until it eventually reaches an absorbing state. This is a state that is as complete as possible given the words so far. Note that this is an absorbing state, it's shown on the figure because there are no arrows leading away from it. So once the model reaches one of these absorbing states, it's done processing that word. The amount of the predicted reading time for that word then is the amount of time it takes for the model to jump around for a while and then eventually end up in an absorbing state. Now, once it reaches an absorbing state, the model reads in the next word, updates its this state transition diagram. It adds new states depending on how the new word can interact with those that preceded it, and the random walk continues. Now I'm going to quickly show how mparse handles two reading time effects, the local coherence effects that I discussed before, and then two types of garden paths. So in local coherence, we had sentences like the coach smiled at the player tossed or thrown the frisbee. For illustration purposes, I used abbreviated materials in the simulations, but I will note that the reading time results are the same if you use the actual materials from Tabor et al. 2004. The really cool thing about the master equation formalism, the math behind this random walk process, is it allows us to really easily calculate the average processing time at each word. So the jumping around that I just showed you is what it looks like on each trial, but we don't actually have to simulate each trial in order to calculate what the average would be if we did do the simulations many times. So that's what I'll show for the data now. On the y-axis here, we have processing time in arbitrary units. And on the x-axis, we have the noise parameter that I've symbolized with t. And this controls how much the model prefers jumping to higher harmony states versus lower harmony states. So here is what the results look like. So in Tabor et al. 2004, they found that the non-reduced forms, the who was tossed or who was thrown, those were read relatively quickly. Those are shown in orange here. And then the reduced forms were read more slowly, shown in the blue. So the coach smiled with the player tossed or thrown. Importantly, just like Tabor et al. 2004 found, the tossed condition, the locally coherent reduced form, is processed even more slowly than the thrown condition. This is nice because this is one of the major data points that motivates even trying out self-organization. So it's good that the model does what we hoped it would. So that's good, but we also want to know how these effects come about, right? So we can do that by looking at the states and the transitions at each word. So this is showing the state and the transitions that are possible at the word thrown in the reduced case. And here, basically wherever the model is, it's very easy to get to the absorbing state on the far right. That's the most complete parse possible given the words. And so on average, because it's so easy to get around and reach an absorbing state, reading times are pretty fast. We can contrast this though with the tossed condition. And basically the only difference here is this sort of dead end state that's shown at the very bottom of the slide. This is the corresponds to the locally coherent parse where the word player attaches as the nominal subject of tossed, and tossed is analyzed as a main verb in that case. Now that is not a complete parse in the for the string of words. We would need another dependency link in order for it to be an absorbing state. So if mparse ends up in this dead end state, it has to keep processing. It can't stop there. And that means it has to backtrack and reanalyze the input that it came before and hopefully find a different path to an absorbing state before it can move on to the next word. And because of the possible need for reanalysis, this leads to the higher average reading times or predicted reading times compared to the thrown case. Note that if we restricted ourselves to only globally coherent parses, then this locally coherent parse wouldn't have been available. And then the processing would be identical in the thrown condition and in the tossed condition and would predict no difference in reading times. So this locally coherent dead end state is really important for explaining this effect here. I'm also happy to talk about the non-reduced forms in the question time, but in the interest of time, I'll move on to garden path effects now. And these I'll also go through pretty quickly. They're mostly basically a sanity check to make sure that the model works for multiple things at once. So I tried out two different types of garden paths. So these NPS garden paths, like the woman saw the doctor had been drinking. If you read this sentence word by word and you get to the doctor, it's perfectly reasonable to attach the doctor as the direct object of saw. But once you continue reading and get to had been drinking, you realize that that's not actually a viable parse, and you have to reanalyze the doctor and attach it as the subject of had been drinking. This is kind of a moderate garden path. People stumble and slow down their reading times at had been drinking, but it's not quite as hard as NPZ garden paths. These are sentences like, before the woman visited, the doctor had been drinking. When the comma's not there, again, you have the same type of ambiguity as before. But in this case, the typical finding is that the garden path effect is larger than the NPS case. So does mparse predict the difference in effect sizes here? Again, the axes are the same here, processing time on the y-axis and the noise parameter on the x-axis. Just to quickly note, the NPZ and NPS garden paths are actually predicted to have the very same reading times here. That's why due to overplotting, you can only see the NPZ case, the solid orange line here. That's the ambiguous garden path condition. So there is a clear garden path. The control conditions in the dashed lines are always lower. They're always processed more quickly than the temporarily ambiguous garden path conditions. That's good. And also there is this interaction between garden path type and ambiguity, where the difference between the ambiguous NPS sentence and the unambiguous NPS sentence is always smaller than that same difference for the NPZ conditions. So there's more to unpack here. The difference that mParse predicts in these garden paths is actually in the control conditions. There's some other stuff going on. We can talk about that in the question time if you like. But as a sort of sanity check, it does do something similar to what people do online. So that's nice. Very quickly, I'll just show that the state transition networks are basically exactly the same. In this case, I'm showing you the NPZ garden path, the unambiguous condition at the top, which looks very similar to the non-locally coherent sentence before. And then the bottom also has this, this is the ambiguous case, the NPZ garden path. And it again has this dead end state here that is the cause for the slowdown. So that's pretty cool, I think. We have basically the same explanation for garden paths and local coherence effects in this model. So with that, I'll summarize now. I presented this new model of self-organized sentence processing as a random walk among partial parses. It successfully predicts both local coherence and garden path reading time effects, and for the same reason. But importantly, the new mathematical framing, sort of what's going on in the background, is really flexible and provides a lot of information about how processing works. So I'm hoping that this will allow broader testing of self-organization while still providing detailed explanations for why the effects are coming about. With that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. Our first question comes from William Schuler. The magic is in the making. Or is it?
Hi, I figured it out.
Okay.
Since it's rewarded for edges, won't the self-organizing model aggressively pursue right-branching analyses and thus garden path too frequently on broad coverage data?
There's a possibility of that. Yeah, you're right. I didn't talk about it in the talk, but one thing that I didn't highlight it too much. The model does prefer structures that are more complete, and so if it can add a link, and it's in a position where it can add that dependency link, then it will tend to do so. I don't know how big of a problem it's going to be. I mean, it does, with the longer the sentences you use and the more complete a grammar you use, the number of states really explodes. So I can't really say at this point if it's going to be a major problem, just because it's hard to anticipate right now if that'll happen significantly more in certain sentences rather than others. The model, I do expect that that garden pathing in a certain sense would be rampant at a small scale, but it should be more pronounced in cases where where we typically observe the effects. At least that's sort of my speculation at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you have an implemented model, though, you could try it on broad coverage data. That might be interesting.
Right. That's one of the things that I'm hoping to do next, is to basically take the binary dependency rules from a parsed grammar and just use that. And with that, it would be pretty broad coverage. I mean, long term, it'd be really nice to just have like a website where you could type in a sentence and out would pop the reading times of each word. I'm a little ways away from that, but it's definitely achievable, I think.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Brian Dillon.
Hi, really interesting work and a super clear talk. Thank you so much, Garrett. I'm wondering whether your model can capture the ambiguity advantage effect. Have you had a chance to test it out on that yet?
I have. I'm glad you asked. There, you should be able to see that slide now. So I have tested it out on the ambiguity advantage effect, and it reproduces the results quite well, actually, I think. So on the top here, we have the processing times, the same as what I showed you for local coherence and garden paths. And this is comparing three conditions: a high attachment preference, low attachment preference, and then ambiguous attachment. And it consistently shows an ambiguity advantage effect with faster processing for the global ambiguity compared to either high or low attachment. On the bottom plot, it's kind of showing the probabilities of building different structures with each one. The ungrammatical structures are sort of odd things that the model constructs based on its grammar rules. It sort of goes a little crazy with all the stuff that it can do in these cases with the grammar that I've tested so far. But basically, the model is more likely to build a grammatical sensical parse for these high and low attachments than making a strange parse. And then in the ambiguous attachment, it's about 50-50 as to where it ends up making the attachment.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Very interesting.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Grusha Prasad.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. This was a really cool, this is really clear presentation and cool work. I just had two questions. Maybe they're both clarification questions. One of it was, what does reanalysis look like? So you said like when it reaches a dead end state, the model has to reanalyze it. Does it just mean that it starts from the beginning, or it just sort of goes back and forth in the loop for a while? That was the first one. And the second one was that in the NPZ and NPS case, it looked like the difference in garden path effect was coming from the unambiguous conditions and not from the ambiguous conditions. And I was wondering if you can comment a little bit on what that means.
Yeah, so for the reanalysis part, it basically looks just like this. Say the model is here and it jumps to this state. This isn't a dead end state, but reanalysis really just means jumping back to where you came from. And so if we have, look like a garden path case here, it would be really similar where if the model ended up in the locally coherent parse, it would just have to jump back to the no structure state. And that would be that.
I see. So to the lower harmony, go to the lower harmony point, right? So taking the lighter line back, is that right?
Yeah, it basically has to go to a dispreferred parse, dispreferred partial parse. And from there, it can then make a different choice, which of course happens at random. But from there, it's free to go wherever. Yeah. And then the garden path, here, bring that up. Right, you're right. The difference is in the control conditions here. And that might be a fluke of the way that I've implemented this grammar. You'll notice that the dashed blue line, the unambiguous, the control condition for the NPS, it sort of diverges off to positive infinity as the noise goes down. The reason that happens is because it also contains, the control condition contains a garden path state. And so it can also sort of, the model can get trapped there and take a long time. Because that can also happen in the control case, the average reading time in the NPS conditions, they tend to stay closer together. Whereas in the NPZ case, the control condition contains no garden path, which we just saw here, it's this here. And so like, yeah, there's no predicted, the two can sort of diverge that way. Yeah, I think that's probably just a consequence of the way I've implemented the grammar so far. I've been thinking about other ways of implementing it that might make a bit more sense and be more realistic. Because the general finding is that it's the differences in the critical conditions, typically, and not under control conditions. So, yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you so much. Cool work again.
Thank you.
We have another question from Laurel Bram, and she has asked that I will read her question, so I'm going to do that. Real cool stuff. How does mParse incorporate misinterpretations like the one we saw in the previous two talks? Does it get stuck in the dead end local optima, and does it do that at human-like rates?
I haven't yet looked at how often the model gets garden pathed. That should be something that I can like calculate pretty easily. Like physicists and like chemists have been working on the master equation for a long time, and they've figured out a lot of cool stuff about it. So I'm hoping to be able to see just how often this happens. As for like the misinterpretations, at this point, I'm only modeling syntactic structure. So if the misinterpretation corresponds to a different syntactic structure, then I think mParse should end up there reasonably often. But I don't yet know how closely its behavior corresponds to that of humans in this case.
Thank you. So we have run out of time before we ran out of questions. So I encourage you to post your questions for Garrett on the website. And right now I will invite you to take a break, maybe hang out in Gather. I believe John has posted the link in the chat. And we will see you back in the Zoom room at 11 Eastern time. Thank you.